All right, so welcome everyone. Again, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Always a pleasure to be learning together. This class, again, is part of Folzman here at Drisha. The class is Death, Love, and Life in the Thought of Franz Rosenzweig with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. Let me see if there's anyone. Yeah, if you're receiving an invitation to become a panelist, it means that you will be able to unmute and participate during class if you wish, asking questions, making comments. You can keep your video on or off. Of course, we would love to see your face if you're willing. Please, just a reminder to stay muted when you're not actively speaking. I'll help mute you if you forget, and just remember to unmute when you would like to make a comment or ask a question. You can also engage in writing. Here is a comment in the chat if you're with us on Zoom, or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you, Evie. We are now in our fourth class in our series on the thought of Franz Rosenzweig. So we have the 4 of 6. So there's no way to compress Rosenzweig's thought into 6 classes. So what I'm trying to do is sort of give you sort of a narrative of his thought, which is certainly appropriate for Franz Rosenzweig, who in many ways is one of the first to think of theology in a narrative sense. But we began that first session with the awareness of death, the confrontation with death, the encounter with death, and what that teaches us about ourselves and potentially the world. We move from there to explore the nature of human singularity, that being created in the image of God means that human beings never quite fit into any box or structure, no matter how accurate or comprehensive we think it might be. And that is what makes us unique, that we sort of have this ability to step out of everything, say no to everything, potentially, even to God. Last week, we introduced sort of really, which is an extension of this, which is the idea of revelation, which Rosenzweig himself calls the keystone of his thought, that revelation is sort of the foundational point in which a lot of his thinking, goes to and emerges from. What's so important about the moment of revelation, that as we talked about last week, is before the moment of revelation, we as human beings live in essentially almost like a world of darkness. We saw some rabbinic texts last week that focused on rabbis visiting other rabbis who were sick, right? And the rabbi who was sick was basically sitting alone in his home in the dark, suffering in pain, essentially in a state of paralysis, if not medically, physically, at least emotionally, psychologically. And it was that other rabbi who came to the home to visit him, that the encounter with them is what basically is transformative, right? That we sort of can't get out of our own narcissism, our own darkness, until we are able to encounter something that is not us. Now, that's true on an individual level, on an existential level, but the claim that Rosenzweig is making is that to a certain extent, as we go through our everyday lives in the modern world, or even in the pre-modern world, we're kind of living in a state of darkness, right? We have these systems of knowledge that we use to make sense of things. But ultimately, even though we seemingly encounter other people, right, we do so in a way that is not this sort of true revelatory encounter that Rosenzweig is talking about, right? We go through life, and I'm going to use language here that Rosenzweig used and what Martin Buber uses, is that most of what we do when we go through life, we encounter people and they are relationships of I-it, right? We see them, we know them, we can describe them, but they're sort of like background players in the drama of our lives. What changes everything are these moments in which we encounter a thou, which we encounter an other, and we realize that we are not the center of the universe. Now, for Rosenzweig, the true moment of where we encounter the other is the moment of revelation, right? That we encounter God. But the way that Rosenzweig asks us to understand that moment of revelation is the moment of encountering the other, the human other, the moment in which we fall in love. Now, the challenge that Rosenzweig recognizes is that particularly in the modern world, we don't really think miracles happen. We think the world has a certain order and structure and rationale to it. So things are the way they are. And the way things were are the way things are going to be. But every so often events occur that seem to totally throw the world, at least our understanding of the world, out of whack. Even though we think there are fixed rules that describe the way the world is supposed to work, every now and again the impossible happens. And suddenly we're left asking ourselves, if we thought we had a system of making sense of the world, right? We had an ideological worldview, values that put everything in its proper place. Suddenly these moments of the impossible come, and they remind us that whatever we thought is simply incomplete, right? That there's something more that we didn't fully understand, and that something more is what we have to take into account to truly, make sense of things. And for Rosenzweig, that classic moment when we encounter something more, right, is that moment of revelation, which for him is, again, best understood as the moment in which we potentially fall in love. Because when you encounter the other and you fall in love with them and you encounter their love for you, right, everything changes. Everything changes. You're never the same again. Now, what's important, we looked at this last time, but I want to just highlight a few key nikudot points about this moment of revelation, the moment when you fall in love. Why is this a miraculous moment? What do we ultimately learn from it? So first and foremost, this idea that you discover the other, right? And if you're young, again, I think it's part of the sins of youth, that when you're young, you're a bit of a narcissist, right? And there's something about when you fall in love with with somebody for the first time, when you're, I don't know, 18, 19, 20, pick the age, it really is sort of like discovering there is another person in the world, right? There's something about when you fall in love that the world goes from revolving around you to suddenly you are caught in somebody else's gravitational orbit. It's now as if you're actually revolving around somebody else to a certain extent, right? And that discovery of another force of gravity in existence just totally changes the way that we think about things. Or when you fall in love, suddenly you're thinking about that person all the time, right? You're thinking about what they want, what they need, right? You're asking yourself, well, I'm having this experience, but how would they experience it if they were here? With me, right? So all of these things change when we fall in love, and all of these things are what change when we experience revelation, or at least when the Jewish people historically experienced revelation, right? You don't look at the world the same way afterwards, right? Because you realize, in a certain sense, everything has changed. That is the model that Rosenzweig is putting forth for us here. We're going to go a bit more on it today. We're going to dig deeper and try to understand it a little bit more, particularly through the idea that Rosenzweig, we talked about just briefly last time, that the moments when we fall in love, the moments when we experience revelation, is also the moment when the other calls our name, right? Falling in love, experiencing revelation is like the experience of having your name being called. That's a very powerful experience, and we'll try to understand why to have your name be called is in itself like a revelatory experience. Let me just load up the. Hold on one second. Okay, so I wanted to actually start today by looking at some examples from Tanakh, biblical examples about love and revelation, and that moment when everything changes, to help us understand that in many ways, Rosenzweig, while he uses a very rich philosophical language, 19th century, early 20th century philosophical language, he is very much drawing on rabbinic and biblical themes. And to the extent that you don't always know how much of it is his ideas, his insights are emerging from philosophy versus how much they're actually emerging from biblical rabbinic texts, because he doesn't always, sometimes he cites rabbinic or biblical sources, but not all the time. But he clearly has a deep familiarity with a lot of biblical and rabbinic sources. And in a certain sense, even if he doesn't know the biblical and rabbinic source, I would argue that in many ways his philosophical insights have a certain universality to them, that he may never have had to read a rabbinic text to discern them, but because they are universal, and you certainly can find them there. So to give you a sense of that moment where you encountering the other, falling in love with the other, right? Your whole world changes, that there's something revelatory about that. So in a certain sense, the best example of this occurs not in the Chumash, but later on in the book of Shmuel. There are two, at least there's probably a few examples. There's two classic examples in Tanakh where characters encounter each other for the first time, and in that moment they fall in love, right? So the one that we maybe would first think about, and it's coming up in a few weeks on Shabbat, right, is when Yaakov has to flee from his brother Esav. He has to leave his parents' home. He goes to his uncle's home, Lavan. On the way there, he's stopping at the well nearby. And who does he encounter at the well? He meets his cousin Rachel. The two of them have a moment, and they seemingly fall in love. There's the evidence that what's the evidence that they fall in love, at least in the initial moment? What happens? Anybody remember? Later on, when he goes to see Lavan, he'll say, I love her. But even before that, there's at least some evidence that we might find that there's a love moment here when they meet at the well. Anybody remember? Well, they kiss, right, which is significant. You could argue maybe they're kissing because there's family and they're embracing, but knowing that they're going to fall in love or they are falling in love, it's hard to look at that kiss as purely naive, right? There's also the famous moment where he lifts the rock off the well by himself, which isn't supposed to be possible. And as we know, right, men historically have done all sorts of, great acts in order to, impress their beloved. But in this case, without, playing into particular gender themes, right, at the very least, he is so moved by his encounter with Rachel that he really wants to lift the rock off the well for them to be able to get water, right? There's something that he is clearly inspired by in that moment that pushes him to do something that it's not supposed to be able to do, right? And again, that's a good example of the way love sort of transforms us and pushes us to do the impossible, right? Because in many ways, that's a fundamental point for Rosenzweig, right? That it's not just that the moment of love is impossible; it pushes us to do the impossible. The other example that I want to focus on more so because I think it's even a better parallel for Rosenzweig is Yonatan and David, right? If you're familiar with the two characters, Yonatan is the son of King Saul. David is going to become the king who takes the place of King Saul because of King Saul's sins. And what happens is that David, after he's sort of chosen by the prophet to become the future king, right, he appears before David and Shaul when Goliath is basically, and the Philistines are oppressing the Jews, and Goliath is basically challenging, Jews or representatives of the Jews to single combat in order to determine like who's really going to be in charge here. Is it going to be the Philistines or the Jews? David volunteers. He fights Goliath. He defeats Goliath. And then David presents himself to Saul and to Jonathan. And what's, of course, striking is that if you know anything about the narrative, David is not the image of the conquering hero, right? When Shmuel first goes to Yishai's house, that's David's father. Yishai has a bunch of sons, right? Shmuel immediately thinks that it's David's brother who must be the future king, because David's brother is the one who's taller and strapping man, strapping lad or whatever. David is the youngest. David is ruddy. David is short. So David is not the image of the conquering hero, but after he defeats Goliath, he presents himself to Shaul, to Saul and Jonathan. And here's what we're told. We're told here, when David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Saul took him into his service that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan and David made a covenant because Jonathan loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing and gave them to David together with his sword, bow, and belt. Right? So if you want to find an example in Tanakh where somebody falls in love like all at once, right, it is really this moment, right? It's the moment when Jonathan sees David triumphant and Jonathan falls in love with David. And again, without assuming that there's a sexual connotation here, because there's at least nothing overt in the text that would give that indication, but it is clear that they fall in love, right? That's literally what happens here. Jonathan falls in love with David. And what's fascinating is what immediately follows that is this idea of brit, of covenant, right? Jonathan and David make a covenant as a way of sealing their love in a permanent sense, right? And this, again, if you're familiar with anything about even the most basics of Jewish thoughts, right, this is the metaphor through which revelation and covenant are typically understood as one of love, right? God it reveals God's self to the Jewish people in an act of love, right? The Jewish people return that love. That mutual love is sealed and made permanent through the act of brit, the act of covenant. And what's fascinating here too about the love story between Jonathan and David is that it's not an easy love story, right? This moment changes Jonathan's life forever. Why does it change Jonathan's life forever? Because going forward, Jonathan is going to come to the realization that his father really is not a good king, and that ultimately David is going to be the one who will be the king. And Jonathan will do everything he can to help David. But here's the challenge. Jonathan loves David and he wants to help David, but by helping David, he actually undermines his own status as the future king. Meaning for Jonathan, love is to a certain extent self-destructive, or at least it cuts against his own self-interest, right? Because it's not going to be about Jonathan anymore. It's going to be about helping David and helping David essentially ascend to the throne. If you know the story, Jonathan dies right before David becomes king, with basically alongside his father, right? So love changes everything. But love also works against our self-interest. When you're bound in a covenant with another human being, right, you feel compelled by them. And that doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it enables us in a certain sense to do things that are impossible. Because in truth, we'll never go against our self-interest unless we are compelled by a force that feels like it's almost something transcendent, which essentially is what the force of love feels like to us. Remember we said last time, love seizes us. Right, the love of the other grabs hold of us. It literally calls to our neshama in Rosenzweig's language. So this example here from Sefer Shmuel about Jonathan and David, right? This in many ways captures all the dynamics that Rosenzweig was talking about, and we'll see continues to teach about. In general, there are many biblical sources that, of course, understand right the revelatory moment, the covenantal moment in terms of love. But again, what's interesting is when you look at them, they do highlight some important details that I just want to mention briefly here. In Devarim, you get a description of the love between God and the Jewish people. And here's how it is described. It's interesting. It says here, this is again Moshe speaking, but Moshe speaking about God's love for the Jewish people. Moshe says, "It is not because you are the most numerous of peoples that God grew attached to you and chose you. Indeed, you are the smallest of peoples, but it was because God favored you and kept the oath to your fathers that God freed you with a mighty hand and rescued you from the house of bondage, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Now, the key detail here that I want to focus in on is that the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that God didn't fall in love with the Jewish people because we were obviously deserving of that love. Right? Remember I said before about David? David is not the image of the conquering hero, right? Yet, nonetheless, Jonathan is transfixed by him, right? So too it was the case with God and the Jewish people. We were not the most attractive on the block, so to speak, right? But God nevertheless falls in love with us. And the reason I think this is so profoundly important is that there's always a sense in which love is arbitrary. Like I fall in love with who I fall in love with. I can try to come up with reasons for it, but those reasons never really get at why we love the people that we love. And in fact, what Devarim is pointing out is that Davka will fall in love with people even if they lack certain attributes that we might think are the desirable attributes, right? The ideal attributes, right? When you think about dating today, right, people always have a fantasy image of who they want their romantic partner to be, right? People have checklists. They got to be this tall. They got to make this much money. They got to be, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And the whole idea is that I want certain expectations of my romantic partner so that they'll be able to enable me to have a certain kind of life, right? Because they're going to meet me in a certain place, right? What Devarim is pointing at is that love doesn't work that way, right? If it did, right, we would always try to choose the partner that, again, checked all our boxes, that was the most attractive, right? That fit our needs. Right. But what Devarim is saying here is that God falls in love with who God falls in love with. Kacha, because that's just the way that love is. You end up with this one and nobody else, right? Even in your own life, right? There's always a profound sense of arbitrariness to the people that we love, particularly our romantic partners, because it is often determined by a certain geography, time and place, geography and history. Like this is where I was at that age when I met this person. And boom, my whole rest of my life is now determined by my relationship to them, right? There's always an arbitrariness there. And that arbitrariness is important because you can't plan. It means you can't plan love ahead of time. Love isn't something you can plan for with your ideal partner and then wait for the right exact moment that you've already set ahead of time and then it happens, right? Love is not a predetermined activity. Love is something that happens to you. It's not something that you plan and implement in the world. And that is to a certain extent what Devarim is getting at. I won't read it inside, but Yechezkel, chapter 16, probably gives one of the more graphic descriptions of God coming upon the Jewish people, raising them, and then falling in love with them. And again, there's a certain arbitrariness here that's very clear, right? God sort of comes upon the Jewish people when they're a baby that's just been born and, basically helpless and, still covered in their the uterine whatever, and then God cleans them up and raises them and falls in love with them and marries them. But again, right, there's not this sense that like God was going through the dating apps to find the ideal nation, right? That's going to be his segula, right? His chosen people, right? That's not the way love works. Love, again, is something that is somewhat contingent and arbitrary. It's an event. It just sort of happens. And that's who you're with now, right? Everything changes because of it. And you look at the world totally differently because your world is no longer, again, this sort of self-enclosure in which you are the center of things. That's, again, sort of background and setup. What we're going to look at today specifically is the way in which Rosenzweig understands the love encounter, the moment of revelation, as a call by the other. It's the moment when God calls your name. That is the moment of revelation. And there's something very, very powerful about this idea that revelation is, and maybe only is for Rosenzweig, and maybe for good reasons, that moment when your name is called. Now, he has all sorts of important philosophical reasons for this that we're going to get at, but the basic notion that revelation consists of God calling, your name is, and then ultimately whether or not we're going to respond to that call, right? That idea emerges directly from the Torah, right? Because what you see throughout the Torah is God turning to human beings, God calling human beings, and it's always contingent upon what the human response to that call will be, right? We see it again and again throughout Torah. We saw it last week in Parshat Vayera, probably one of the more famous examples. We'll see it again in just a little bit, right? God calls Abraham's name, and if Abraham is willing to answer that call, like what does Abraham say? Right? Abraham says Hineni, right? Hineni is the way in which we respond to the call of love by the other, right? The other says, I'm going to use myself as example. When my wife calls Zach, right? Whether I choose to answer that call, be present to that call, accept the responsibility of that call, all of that is summarized in the response of Hineni. I'm here, right? I am here. I'm answering. I am responsible, right? That is the call and response of revelation, and it happens throughout the Torah, right? Maybe most famously with Abraham and God, but the same thing happens at the burning bush. Right? Moshe encounters the bush that is burning, and God calls out to Moshe and says, Moshe, and Moshe responds, Hineni, right? That's the paradigmatic way in which revelation is to be understood. God calls your name, and there's always that moment, right, when God calls your name, where like you have a choice whether or not you're going to answer and say Hineni, right? You don't have to say Hineni. I think this is important, right? The moment of revelation is a moment in which you can hear your name called and be compelled by it, but at the same time, you don't have to say Hineni. You can keep going on your life like the way you've been going, right? Or you can choose to turn and run away from it, right? The best example of that would be, Yonah, right? God reveals God's self to Yonah, right? He gives them a task. Yonah does not respond Hineni, right? Yonah literally runs the other way, literally goes in the opposite direction of what God wanted from him, right? So there's always that possibility when we hear the call. We can either say Hineni and everything that is bound up in that, or we have the opportunity to turn and just go the other way and just keep going on our day, essentially. So for Rosenzweig, the idea that revelation is calling our name, well, we have to understand he builds up to that. Because the very first moment of revelation, or maybe the more important one, is one in which God turns to human beings and doesn't call them by name. And that seemingly is a problem. And that's the narrative of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The moment that Rosenzweig hones in on here, which I think is a very important moment, that he identifies some really significant things, is after Eve and Adam have eaten from the tree of knowledge. What happens when they eat from the tree of knowledge? Right, they have achieved some sense of awakening or enlightenment. They recognize their nakedness. They cover themselves up, and then they hide. Right, essentially, right. There's a sense of shame. There's a sense of like, like what are we doing here? And what happens next in the narrative is as follows. It says, they heard the sound of God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the human and his wife hid from God amongst the trees of the garden. Right? They've eaten from the tree. They have self-consciousness. They know they've sinned to a certain extent. They know they were naked. Now they hear God coming. And like any good child who knows they've really screwed up, right? When they hear Ima or Abba start opening the door, coming their way, right? The kids run, right? And they hide, right? Because they don't want to have to confront what they've actually done, right? There's a full awareness of what they've done. That's what the hiding reflects. But at the same time, what it also shows is their absolute unwillingness to be able to acknowledge it or take responsibility for it. Now, what's fascinating is what happens next in the narrative, right? God's come, they know he's come, and then we're told God called out to the human or Adam and said to him, Ayeka, where are you? Now, of course, anybody who reads this narrative, right, God just created the world, right? God just did the impossible, miracle after miracle. It seems pretty clear God knows where Adam and Eve are. So when God asks, where are you? Clearly there is more going on here, right? Rashi famously says, the whole idea of this is that God is trying to engage Adam and Eve in a dialogue, right? In a moment where perhaps they can think deeply about what they've done, taking responsibility for it, and even do tshuva, right? This Ayeka, where are you, is a soft way of opening the conversation, right? It's a parent, for example, if they know that their child has done something wrong, right? Like the parent has two options, right? The parent can scream their child's name, like in a blood-curdling anger, but that usually is not going to be a great way to start a conversation in which the child's now going to recognize what they did wrong, how they did wrong, and take responsibility for it. But that's option A. That's the option I probably take more often than I would like as a parent. Right? Option B would be to find a way to like slowly engage them in a conversation in which they can, you don't start coming at them hard, right? You open soft and let them sort of be able to meet you and maybe engage in a discussion about what actually happened and what the problem might be. So God says, where are you? Even though he knows, where they are. And presumably Adam and Eve, when they hear this, they know that God knows where they are. So on a certain level, they maybe ideally should recognize it as an invitation. But here's how Adam responds. He says, I heard the sound of you in the garden, you God, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. So again, it's not exactly what God asked. He's not answering that exact question per se. What Adam is already doing is justifying why he was hiding. And what he's saying is, well, I heard you and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Right. And presumably he's afraid that because he's naked, because he's aware because of his nakedness that he's sinned and therefore he's hiding. But it's not the again, I have young children. So if you catch them doing something wrong, which you are guaranteed to get is like a string of like words and statements that don't all fit together, that in some way are not really getting at what you're asking, but a little bit. And what you're seeing here in Adam's words are a bit of more than a little bit of a deflection, right? It's not really describing what took place. He doesn't immediately say, I sinned, God, and I'm sorry, which is what God presumably really wants. He's sort of deflecting and working his way around it in a way that it's clear that he knows there's a problem, but can't really get at it. God says to him, who told you that you were naked? Right? Did you eat from the tree which I had forbidden you to eat? Again, interestingly enough, not just declaring, I know what you've done, Adam, it's now time for your punishment. It's engaging in a conversation. Adam says, the woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate. Right? So, of course, when God asks, did you sin? Right? What Adam does not do is say the words that he's supposed to say, which is, yeah, I sinned, God. Right? Instead, what does he do? He blames the woman. And not only does he blame the woman, he implicitly also blames God, because he's saying, the woman caused me to sin, and you're the one who gave me the woman, implying again, God, you're the real problem behind, all of this. So again, deflection. God turns to the woman, asks her, what have you done? And the woman replies, the serpent duped me and I ate. Right. So same with Eve, right? And though given a direct answer, offers a deflection as a response, right? This is not, even though God, you might argue, is attempting to have a real conversation here, right? It's not a real conversation in the sense that it doesn't lead to any kind of true responsibility and therefore really openness to engaging the other, right? Adam and Eve can't take responsibility for what they've done, which means they can't really have a true encounter with God, right? Because if they can't take responsibility, right, there's essentially a wall of deflections between them and God, right? So this dynamic is one that's going to be very important for Rosenzweig, because what God doesn't do in this whole conversation is he doesn't call them by name. He just says, where are you? And where are you may be a way to open a conversation, but it's a conversation that is still at the level of I, it. It's not a conversation at the level of I, thou. And the reason that we know it's a conversation at the level of I, it is the way that Adam and Eve respond, right? They're not able to say I, like I am responsible, right? Like what they keep saying is the woman, the snake, this, that, right? Like they can't say I, and their inability to say I is in part because God didn't call their name, right? And it's the moment when God calls your name, or anytime somebody calls our name, that is the moment where we can say I, because it is the moment in which we recognize the way in which we stand apart from everything else, right? Up until the moment somebody calls our name, we're just sort of like immersed in whatever we're doing, part of whatever we're doing. But the moment our name is called, it's like as if we are selected out. It's as if we now stand apart, and it's now just us and the one who called us, right? It's like, as I've said before, love is the moment when the whole sort of world fades away and it's just you and the other. But that's what happens when somebody calls your name, right? It's as if the whole world fades away and it's just you and them, right? Face to face, right? That is what happens when the other calls our name and we're able to turn and, essentially answer it. With Avraham, what is different is that Avraham is the one whom God calls by name, right? Particularly in the narrative of the Akedah, right? God calls to Avraham. It says here, Avraham, Vayomer Hineni. Right? God is going to test Avraham. He calls to Avram. He says, Avram. And Avram says, Hineni. Right? It's interesting. I'll just note, too, from sort of a literary perspective, the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to say repetitively that God calls people by name, right? Vayomer elav Avraham. Right? Like, it's almost like, why do we need to know this, right? This isn't like details that really should be here. It's like extra, but clearly the Torah understands that calling of the name is essential to the moment of revelation, the encounter, the event that takes place between God and human beings, right? That's why it keeps coming in here again and again and again. God calls Avram, he calls Avram, and Avram responds with Hineni. And again, Hineni is the moment of not just saying yes, right? It's the moment of saying, like, I am here. Right? I respond. I take responsibility for your call, right? It's not just even like I'm answering you. It always has a futurity to it, right? When Avram says Hineni to God's call, he's saying not just that I'm here, but I'm also here for what is to follow, right? Knowing that God wants something. And the answer to Hineni is saying not just that I'm answering the initial call, but I'm also answering the desire that is to come in the call itself, right? That extends and extends ultimately from it. We see it also again at the end of the Akedah, right? The moment in which Avram is standing with the knife over Yitzchak. This time his name is called as well, not by God, ironically, at least in the context of the narrative, by an angel. It says, Vayikra elav malach Hashem min hashamayim. The angel calls out from heaven to stop Abraham, basically. And here we're told, Vayomer Avraham, Avraham. Right? At the end of the Akedah, Abraham's name is called twice, right? Because sometimes there may be moments where we're so immersed in the world that God's not enough for just God to call our name once, right? There are times, like, I know we know this with our kids or with our spouses, right? Once isn't enough. We got to call them a couple times to make sure that they actually can hear us. And in many ways, again, you can ask yourselves, which is the harder moment to say Hineni to? Is it the first one or the second one, right? By virtue of the fact that he has to call Avram's name twice, it certainly sounds like it's the, the end of the Akedah, right? Where Avram has to be able to step out of what he's doing, all right, what he's committed himself to, the impossible, to answer, to answer God, God once more. So this is Rosenzweig looks at these narratives and sees it as essential for philosophically understanding what happens in the context of Revelation. I'm going to read a little bit of this inside, and I'm going to show you how it plays out. What's also fascinating, I'll note here, is that there are Hasidic sources that in many ways echo Rosenzweig's insights around Revelation about the call of the other. So I'm going to read a little bit of those too, because I think it's important here just to see how, again, all of these ideas are coming from a very, very Jewish place. So Rosenzweig is noting here when God calls to Adam and says, Ayeka in the Garden of Eden, where are you? Right, Rosenzweig continues, he says, this is nothing else but the question about the you. Right, the idea of where are you singles out the you, right? There is an other, a singular other, who is the answer of that question, right? The I discovers itself at the moment where it affirms the existence of the you through the question about where it is. What he's noting here is that we actually affirm our own selfhood when we call to another person, right? When I say you, specifically when we say you, right, it always implies an I. There's an I, there has to be an I to call out the you. So when we say, hey, you, right, on a certain level, we are acknowledging our own self, right? In the way that they're, like I said before, the I and the you, the I and the thou are these entities that sort of step out of the rest of the world in that moment. He says here, it discovers itself and not the you. The question of the you remains a mere question. But the problem is when you say, hey, you, and in a strange sense, Rosenzweig is flipping it around. We might say when you say, hey, you, it's all about the you. Rosenzweig is saying it's the opposite. When you say, hey, you, it affirms you as the one who can call the other. But when you say, hey, you don't really know anything about the other at all, right? Because it's essentially an anonymous other, right? Because the you could be any you, right? It could be you, right? It's really not about them at all, right? You say, hey, you to a stranger, right? Like, and it's really about almost asserting your own, I don't want to say mastery or control, but like it's about you are the I that's calling that you over there. But you don't even know who the you is, because if you knew who the you was, you would call them by name, right? We never say, hey, you, to somebody that we know, to somebody whose name we know, right? Hey, you is something we would only essentially say to a stranger. So for Rosenzweig, there's something lacking in that kind of call. He says, and there's good reason then, that kind of call is not going to arouse or awaken the I of the other. He says, the man hides. He does not answer. He remains mute. He remains the self as we know it, right? That's the problem when God calls to Adam. Adam can't respond to that with an I, right? Remember we said it was deflection. It's disavowal. It's not I. Yes, God, I'm here. I am responsible. He says the answers that God finally gets to his questions are not answers to the divine question of the you, and are not an I, not an it is I, nor in it is I who did it. Meaning the question that God wants, the answer that God wants is an I. Like I wants Adam to take responsibility for himself and in the fullness of himself in relation to God and in relation to the other. But Adam can't do that. He can't say I. It's all about it. It's all about them. Rather, instead of the I, it is a he, she, it that comes out of the answering mouth. Right? The man objectifies himself in order to become the male human. The woman, for her part, totally objectified as woman, who is given to the man, is the one who did it, and then she throws the guilt on the last it was the serpent, right? Each deflection after deflection, in which nobody can say I, right? And that's because hey, you is never going to get you an I response, right? If you see somebody, I'll give an example, like you see somebody on the street and they're doing something wrong, and you scream at them, hey, you, like hey, you, what are you doing? Right? Like that's not going to be a way to engage them in a real conversation, right? At best, you're going to get a defensive answer. It's not going to be an I answer. It's going to be, a deflection or whatever. And that's the problem, because you can only get an I answer when there's something about the intimacy of being able to call the other by name, right? That changes the way that we experience it. Now, what I want to just highlight for a moment here is this idea that God calls to Adam, Harishon, as a universal call, right, as a call to all human beings, is an idea that appears by the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Lubavitch. And he offers this is a story actually recounted by Buber. Again, I don't know if Rosenzweig knew this. I'm not sure this story was published, but at this time when he wrote the Star of Redemption, but he does later on read other Hasidic stories by Buber. So here's the story. Oh, you know what? We're gonna run out of time. I'm not gonna read this story. I'll summarize it real briefly. Right, Alter Rebbe is in jail. Right, first Rebbe Lubavitch is in jail. He's been potentially informed upon by the Misnagdim, those who oppose the Hasidim. While he's in jail, the non-Jewish jailer kind of makes a relationship with him, kind of is impressed by him, and he decides to ask him questions about the Bible. Right, because he's got a great rabbinic scholar. Might as well ask him questions about the Bible. The jailer's a Christian, but again, like Jews know a lot about the Bible. So he asked them specifically about the question of Ayeka, where are you? And he raises the problem that everybody comes up with when they read that verse is, why is God asking, where are you? Doesn't God know where they are? And here's how the Alter Rebbe responds. He says, do you believe that the scriptures are eternal and that every era, every generation, every man is included in them? Right, that's what he asked the jailer, right? This message, the message of the Torah is an eternal message. It's not just for a particular time and place. It wasn't just for Adam in that moment. The jailer says, yeah, I agree with you. It's eternal. Well then, said the tzaddik, in every era, God calls to every man. Where are you in the world? So many years and days of those allotted to you have passed. How far have you gotten in your world? God says something like this. You've lived 46 years. How far along are you? When the chief of the gendarmes heard his age mentioned, he pulled himself together, laid his hand on the Rav's shoulder, and cried, bravo, but his heart trembled. So two things are going on here. Number one is the call of where are you, the Alter Rebbe is saying, is a universal existential call from God to human beings. It's God like calling you to take responsibility or take account of who you are and where you are in the world, right? And there's something unsettling about that. I have a birthday coming up in 2 days. Right. So birthdays are kind of a moment where you feel like you're sort of held to account for who you are and where you are in the world. And it's not always so easy, especially as you get older, right, to like hit your birthday, because it's, you know, it forces you to have to reflect in ways that aren't so pleasant. It forces you to look at your eye. Right. That's one part of this. And that message is that God calls us to account for that. It's for all of us. We all have moments where we're experiencing that. The second part of the story is that the Alter Rebbe seemingly makes up a number and says, you know, you live 46 years and God's calling out, where are you? How far along are you? And the jailer happened to be 46 years old. So when he hears the Rebbe say this, right, it really makes him feel like that this interpretation is like coming out of Shemayim, right? It's like God's calling to the jailer right now, where are you? Like, are you going to take responsibility? Now, the problem with this sort of abstract universal call for human beings to take responsibility, to like take account of themselves, is, as we saw already in Rosenzweig, it's very easy to deflect that, right? To be human means to experience moments which call you to take account on some level, but in truth, it's very easy to deflect that. It's very easy not to stand up and say I, right? To say hineni, like I am here in those moments, and that's the challenge. The way in which we can do that potentially is when we hear our name being called. And that's exactly what Rosenzweig goes on to say here, that to sort of break the spell of our narcissism, we have to hear our name being called. And for Rosenzweig, the moment we encounter the other and kind of fall in love with them, right, that's the moment where we hear our name called, right? To go back to the example of David and Jonathan, right, which is a good way to think about this. Right, when David presents himself to Jonathan and Saul after defeating Goliath, right, and we read how Jonathan falls in love with David in that moment, you have to read that as if Jonathan is hearing his name be called by David. Right, it's not explicit, right? It's not literally having his name being called, but the way in which Jonathan feels compelled by David, drawn to David, bound by David, right? His soul is now bound up in David's soul, right? It's as if Jonathan's name is being called by David. And Jonathan responds to that call with this response of covenants, of brit, or what Rosenzweig is going to say here is hineni, right? To respond to love, right, in an act of covenantal commitment is always to say, here I am, I'm going to be with you. I am with you. You are mine, I am yours, I will be with you, right? And that's the key moment when we hear our name being called. But the moments in which we hear our name being called by God, by the other, these are not commonplace moments. They don't happen very, very often. But when they do, everything changes for us. And again, I talked about before, falling in love with your spouse. I think this equally applies with when your children are born. There's a moment, especially when your first child is born, at least for me, where when they come into that room for the first time, it feels like they are calling your name, and everything is now going to be different. Right. And there's a question there when a parent like holds their child for the first time, right? When they have to like say to themselves on some level, like to this child, like Hineni, like I am in this now forever, right? And it's not automatic, right? I'm not saying it happens in the birthing room, but at some point there or soon after, right, the call of your child to you, or just even their screams, so to speak, right? It demands a response, and it demands like a question of like, am I going to be there? Am I going to be committed? Because that call of your child, it changes your whole existence. You're never the same afterwards. Like your whole world is now fundamentally structured in a different fashion. I'll just note too that the Baal Shem Tov, Magid and Mezrich also talk about the idea of having your name being called, awakening your soul, right? And then even a person who's half asleep, if you call their name, they'll wake up, right? There's something about having your name being called, as I keep saying, that wakes you up and like takes you out of wherever you were, right? That's for Rosenzweig, having your name being called is in many ways the foundation of human freedom, because it takes us out of where we were and orients us in a totally different kind of direction, right? The Torah doesn't use it this way, but when Avram is told Lech Lecha, God doesn't call out to him with his name. But Lech Lecha is a moment, essentially, where you could say Avram's name is being called, and he is being called to go in a new direction that will change everything. And like the question is, like, when that moment comes, can we answer it? Can we can we respond to it? The other piece I want to focus on with just the time that we have remaining here is the way in which being called by the other is in many ways the essence of mitzvah. It's the essence of commandment, right? To confront the other's love is like having your name being called by the other. And that moment is a moment in which you feel compelled by them. And I think this is very, very important, because for Rosenzweig, the experience of commandments, of mitzvah from the other, is at the heart of all, Jewish religiosity, at the heart of revelation. There can't be revelation without mitzvah, right? They have to, and this is important because for Buber, who has a certain similarity to Rosenzweig on some of these issues, right? Revelation is sort of an encounter, a revelatory encounter, but there's no mitzvah for Buber. Or if there's a mitzvah, it's a self-imposed one. I encounter the other and I can choose how I want to respond to that. I'm inspired to respond, but I choose and all that. For Rosenzweig, to have the other call your name is to be compelled by the other, right? Because if you're in the midst of one thing, right, and all of a sudden you hear your name being called, right? There's a moment, even I would say precognitive. What do you do, right? If you're even if you're totally immersed in something and suddenly you hear your name being called, what's the instinctive reaction? Right? So turn around, like see who's calling your name, right? Like that is the experience of compulsion. That's the experience of mitzvah, is that moment in which you're not even thinking. It's not the experience of mitzvah is not a cognitive act of like feeling compelled and submitting to it or something like that. The experience of mitzvah is like I'm already compelled before I even can like think about it, right? And then at a certain point I have to say, am I going to follow through on it? But it already is like pulling me. I feel the gravitational force of it even before I'm like even fully aware of what's happening. That's what the call of the other is. That's what the experience of mitzvah is. And it's the experience of love, right? When the other calls to you in love, right? That love always reflects a certain desire and even need, right? Because when somebody says, I love you, right? What's the response they want back from you? What's the response they want back when somebody says, I love you, right? The response they want back is for you to say, I love you back, right? Like that is essentially what, when the other calls our name, right? It compels us. There's something about it we can't escape. We feel it. And the question is like, can we respond to it? Can we say hineni? Can we say I love you? I always use this example where I had I'm just laughing because my mother happens to be on here too. So one of the women I was dating before I met my wife, so this is already more than 20 years ago, we were only dating for a couple of months. And I remember how my girlfriend said to me at the time, I love you. And it was like, I don't know, I've been dating like 2 months or something. And I was like, the problem in a relationship is somebody has to say, I love you first, right? So there's always a risk involved, but there's always, again, something arbitrary, spontaneous about it. And you don't know how the other is going to respond. So in that moment, when my girlfriend said, I love you, I knew I did not love her. And I was not going to respond back, I love you. And I remember turning to her and saying, like, I like you a lot, right? So like, probably that ended the relationship. Like, I mean, we might have dated for a couple more months, but that's that shows that there wasn't like a real, whatever there in a certain sense. Because the call of I love you, right, demands only one response, whether or not you can say, I love you back. And again, the challenge of that is when you hear the other say I love you the first time, right, it's a scary moment because it's a moment that implies to us that everything can and will change depending on how we choose to answer that, right? And because there's a compulsion there. It's scary, it's intimidating, right? Like, and you have to ask yourself, like, can I meet it? Can I say hineni to it? Is that something that's possible within me? But for Rosenzweig, the experience of mitzvah, being a Jew, of feeling obligation is to feel God's love, is to feel God call our name. That's what mitzvah is all about. Rosenzweig famously says, love cannot be commanded, right? Somebody cannot tell you to, demand that they love them and that's it. But in truth, when somebody says, I love you, it can arouse and inspire love in response, right? Like this is again, the classic example with parents and children, right? Our children are born into this world, right? As like naked, helpless babies. And they can cry and scream and nuzzle and snuggle or whatever it is, right? They can't say, I love you. They can't command our love in any kind of verbal sense. But when they call to us, and they do, right, there's something about it that we hear our name being called by them, even when they're infants, and it inspires our love in return, right? Their need and desire for us inspires our love for them. It compels it, right? That's what makes it so difficult and so scary. But that is what at the heart of covenant is all about. We don't have time to go into it in any great depth, but we talked about God and Adam in the Garden of Eden. We talked about God and Abraham. The other classic moment in which essentially we have a moment of love in which God calls out to human beings, it is the moment of Har Sinai, right? The moment of covenant. Now, in that example, right, God isn't calling out, right, like the names of 600,000 Jews, but it's very clearly understood as a moment in which God is turning to the people, as Moshe himself says, face to face, panim el panim. That's the way Har Sinai is, and speaking to the people directly, speaking to each and every Jew in a direct fashion. And while we typically think of Har Sinai as this awe-inspiring and terrifying moment, which it is, in part, it's awe-inspiring and terrifying because it is the moment when God turned to the Jewish people and said, I love you, right? And I'll never forget, like I said, when my girlfriend said that to me, there's probably a moment where I was like, oh my God, like terrified, like, because I knew what it meant and I knew I wasn't able to respond, right? There's something, very, very challenging about those kind of moments when you're faced with like your whole future in front of you. And again, I'll just note here that Shir HaShirim Rabbah specifically understands the moment at Har Sinai as a moment of love. Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, all about love. Now, I'll note that Rosenzweig talks a lot about Shir HaShirim in Revelation, right? Because what happens in Shir HaShirim is the lover and beloved are constantly calling out to each other. You, and the other one will respond, I, and you, and I. And there's this back and forth. What you don't have in Shir HaShirim is you don't have that initial moment where they fall in love. Right, Shir HaShirim is, if you know the expression in media res, right? Like Shir HaShirim is after the narrative has already started. It's the romantic comedy after they've already fallen in love, which is not, that's like really the end of the romantic comedy. Like we always want to know like everything leading up to the moment they fall in love. That's not Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim picks up right in the middle of love. So we don't exactly have that initial moment where there's a call and a falling in love, but that is in large part what Har Sinai is. God lifts the mountain up over their heads, and the Midrash connects that to the verse where it says, under the apple tree, I awakened you, right? Which is describing, the lover and beloved, how they, the desire of the one arouses the desire of the other. And that is the moment where God picks the mountain up over the Jews' heads. Again, other Midrashim or other rabbinic texts liken that moment at Har Sinai, the lifting up of the mountain, that it's either, of course, to crush them or threaten them, but it's also can be understood as the chuppah, right? This is the moment in which the Jewish people's love with God is coming together and concretizing and materializing. Again, there's another Hasidic text that expresses this very, very clearly. This is also from the Alter Rabbi of Lubavitch, who from an essay on Purim. I won't read it inside. We don't have time for that. But the Alter Rabbi's point is that at Har Sinai, what arouses the Jewish people's love for God is God's love for them. God loves the Jewish people. He directs all that love right at us, and we feel compelled by it. and that arouses our own love, right? Again, what's more terrifying than when you bring your child home as an infant the first time from the hospital and they're vulnerable and helpless and like crying and screaming for you and like, oh my God, it's like, what do I do with this? Can I answer this? Like every first time parent is always like, can I do this? How do I feel about this thing? Like, where am I going to be? Right. But nevertheless, that profound desire and need of the infant is what ultimately arouses the profound love of the parent. That's exactly what happens at Har Sinai. God calls out to us in love and calls our names, and that arouses love within us and fear. And specifically, the Alter Rebbe ties that to the mountain being lifted up and the mountain encompassing them, like the chuppah and all of that. Again, we don't have time to go into it, but I just wanted to note that that's exactly the moment of Har Sinai. And again, what it all boils down to is the question of, can we say, hineni? Can we say yes to it? Right. And it's not an easy thing to say yes to the call of the other, the call of love. Now, the last thing I want to get at here for Rosenzweig, that Brit, the covenantal moments where, the two sides are committing to each other, right? That is best understood as setting forth, marriage, right? If revelation is the moment when the God and the Jewish people fall in love, right? Then covenant is, what does it mean to now build a life together? Marriage is about how we take the romantic moment of falling in love and now make it something permanent and real within the world. And as anybody knows, right, the real work is not falling in love, right? Though there is a profound moment where if you can say yes to love, right, that's in many ways the hardest thing. But the real work is what comes afterwards, is taking that moment and now, making it real in the course of a lifetime. And for Rosenzweig, the experience of being a Jew is essentially to be born into a marriage with God, right? And trying to take that love, that call of the other, and concretizing it through our day-to-day lives. He says, your marriage is not love. Marriage is infinitely more than love. Marriage is the fulfillment on the outside. In it, love comes from its blissful inner completeness and stretches out its hand in a helpless and unquenchable longing. Oh, that you were my brother, right? In Shir Shirim, they're lovers, but they also talk to each other in terms of brother and sister, right? That we want, this is a longer point, but I'll just summarize it briefly for Rosenzweig, is that what we want in marriage is the intimacy of siblings. And what I mean by this, obviously, marriage has a sexual component to it. So that's not, what he's getting at here, though, is that what marriage also has over time is a naturalness of intimacy that would like only exist on a certain level, like with siblings, right? There's something about the sibling relationship that is natural and real and intimate, right? That we are trying to turn the romantic relationship into something like that, something inextricable, right? You can't escape a sibling. They are bound to you, right? In a sense, through history and parents, right? And that's what essentially comes out of the marital relationship. And the challenge that we don't have time to explore this, unfortunately, in these classes, is for Rosenzweig's conception of Judaism and many aspects of Judaism, or how do we keep love in a marriage without turning that love into something fixed, or without turning that love into essentially like making an idol of the other, right? Which is the hardest thing, because once you go from love to marriage, right, the greatest challenge is to not turn to the other person and not to idealize them into some, trophy, and not to turn them into a fixed image, right? Which can never change, because it has to fit certain expectations that you have and you need, right? To enable the other to still be an other in the context of a marriage is always the hardest thing, right? Because the way that makes marriages work often is by having each side sort of freeze themselves in a particular position so that everybody knows their roles and responsibilities, so they can sort of just hold it together for the next 40 or 50 years, right? Except human beings can never be frozen in place, right? So the greatest challenge is, how do we let people be all of who they are, right, in the context of a relationship that is going to be fixed and bound to each other in ways that are also, also unchanging. But that's not for this time. I just wanted to mention that briefly. What I wanted us to take away ultimately is this idea that revelation is the moment we hear our name being called, and it compels us and it scares us. It's a call of love. It's a call in which everything can change. And the challenge is whether we can say no and fully commit to it. And then once we've committed to it, how do we make a space for that call to keep reemerging, right? For Jews, right, the study of Torah, for example, is one of the primary places in which we enable ourselves to keep hearing God's call to us, And at the same time, for Rosenzweig, doing mitzvot is the way that we are able to answer God's call and be able to show our love back to back to God. But again, when you fall in love, everything changes. You, the other, and the world. And the challenge is, how do we hold that space to be able to live it and make it a full reality? Stop there, and I'm happy to open up for questions if anybody has.
Hi, I would. This is amazing. It's very profound, and I have to tell you, I've tried to read Rosenzweig, and you've opened up a lot of things that I haven't been able to access. So I certainly thank you for that. One thing I find interesting in Lech Lecha, God speaks of how numerous we will be, but doesn't really address the idea of loving us. Whereas in Dvarim, there is this statement, you're among the smallest, and that's when the love seems to be expressed directly. So there's this inversion that I find extremely interesting.
So no, that's a good point. So one of the things I enjoy with Rosenzweig is taking his theoretical ideas and putting them back in text that may or may not like totally fit, but even regardless, it always reveals things, right? Like, so what I would say is that to a certain extent, Avraham and God's relationship never fully reaches a full covenantal expression, because it's not, and we know that because there's not really mitzvot, right? Like Avraham it's very spontaneous and free, and each one is a presence in on the other's life, meaning God and Avraham, in ways that is profound for each, but it never fits. It seeks to be translated into a sort of continuous and rigid framework of any kind whatsoever. So I guess what I would say is that it's like they're in the like Lech Lecha and Vayera. And again, we talk about the 10 tests of Avraham, right? Like, so that whole stretch of those two parshas is God constantly calling Avraham's name, and Avraham constantly struggling to be able to say, like, can I say Hineni? And they're in this like profound moment of like call and response, but it doesn't actually translate to sort of the ongoing experience of marriage. And then what happens also is what you're getting as reflection. Like, I can look back, when you're in the midst of like the turbulence of falling in love, you can't really look at it from the outside, right? That's the greatest challenge. And to a certain extent, that is where Avraham is in, right? Like Avraham and God are in that sort of back and forth. But it is, very much like the turbulence, chaos, the world transforming of like falling in love. And the act of turning into that something concrete and enduring is ultimately left to Avraham's descendants. That's what makes Avram amazing, is that he lives his whole life like in this sort of spontaneous, transformative, chaotic, God's calling and he's responding. And every time, like, the world turns upside down. Every test for Avraham is like a moment where the world turns upside down and like has to look at things differently. And like, what is he going to do? And the fact that Avraham can still answer Hineni to every one of those moments is what makes him so profound, right? Most of us can't do that if it happens once in our life, right? Like, he just somehow is able to keep hearing that call and responding. And in modeling that shows us something truly, profound.
I don't want to address this now to say too far afield, but I'd just like to ask this. I know Rosenzweig was severely disabled at the end of the 1920s and then passed away. Mm-hmm. Did he know of Hitlerism, and did he know of like the profound things that took place in terms of like physics and science and the transformative time that he was in?
So it's an interesting question. So he actually, I heard this from Paul Mendes-Flohr, who is probably one of the great Rosenzweig scholars. So Mendes-Flohr says, I don't know if it's true or apocryphal, that like Rosenzweig and Einstein lived in the same building in, I don't know if it was Berlin or probably Berlin. So we're talking about like 1913 or so, and that the two of them played violin and they actually like practiced together. So like, I was kind of blown away when I heard that. Everybody knew. At that point, I'm not sure if Einstein he probably was a well-known figure already at that point. So look, everything is changing in the early 20th century. Rosenzweig is his profound understanding of German idealism and German philosophy and history enables him to see things, and he's living at a time of rupture, which he gets. So he's able to take sort of the past and think think things anew in very profound, innovative ways. He doesn't know science and relativity, right? Theory of relativity or anything like that. But he is the thinker who is trying to think through break and rupture. He sees the world changing profoundly, and he is trying to take everything that has been and rethink it for the moment. And that's what revelation is. Revelation is the possibility that everything can change, right? And so his thought, models that same dynamic, which I think part of the reason I think that's so important is, especially in the time we're in right now, right? We are particularly sensitive to the way that the world ruptures and something new comes, and we're not prepared for it. But we also have to try to recognize that the systems of thinking that we've used, can only get us so far. And at some point, something new is going to have to break through, and that's not going to be simple or easy or necessarily pleasant, right? Rosenzweig is a scholar both in his personal life and in his looking of history, recognizes that. So you have to be a thinker who can think through it, who can be open to the possibility of a break, to think something that is truly innovative. Because otherwise you're just stuck in what's been and trying to rework it. And he is willing to recognize that sometimes everything comes crashing down, but there's still things that remain. And how do we think forward, think anew going forward? Hitlerism is a more complicated question. He didn't see that. I mean, he dies in 27 or 29. So, he's living during Weimar when he's having health issues. So there's definitely a lot of instability in German society, and he's aware of that. He does not seem to be as aware as he should about how dangerous theoretically he understands fascism and nationalism, but he doesn't really connect the dots to what's happening in Germany, in the late 20s, let's say. But A Star of Redemption has a whole, large section of it is essentially dealing with issues of fascism. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. We'll be together again next week, and thank you so much to everyone who participated today here on Zoom and also live on Facebook. I don't see any questions on Facebook, so we'll close with this.
Next week we'll focus on redemption, which is if revelation is turning to God or God turning to us, redemption is turning to the other, the human other, the neighbor. And then with our last session, we'll come back to this question of life and death and Rosenzweig's own life and thinking about what does it really mean to live given all this.
Okay, looking forward to that. And also we have a Mishnah learning continuing this fall with Mishnah in depth, Masachet Yevamot with Rabbi David Silber. It's this Sunday at 1 p.m. We also have Genesis to Exodus from Family to Nation with Rabbi David Silber as well. Back again this Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern. And as always, many more classes scheduled. You can learn more on our website, darisha.org /fall and /fall. And then again, we'll see each other for the continuation of this class next week. Lehitraot for now.